think in the 1950s, 1 in 20 individuals in the labor force was required to get a license to work. But today, it's 1 in 3.
Hi everybody, I'm Jake Pozick. I'm the policy analyst at the Maine Heritage Policy Center, and today we're here for another Maine policy discussion, except this time, instead of talking to some gubernatorial candidates, we have State Senator Eric Brakey here with us, who's going to talk about the issue of occupational licensing. Thank you, Eric, for being here, and welcome to the Maine policy discussion.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, Jacob. Thank you for having me. And this is a topic I care very much about, occupational licensing reform. So I'm glad to be here and speak with you.
And it's evident that this is something that's important to you, because in the first session of the 128th legislature, you sponsored LD 1036, which for those who are watching this and unaware, that bill asked for the review of 24 occupational licensing regimes in Maine. It was based off of the Institute for Justice's License to Work study, which is a pretty landmark study as it relates to occupational licensing, especially the scope of it throughout the nation. So what I want to know is, how did the issue of licensing rise to the level where you wanted to be involved? What really inspired you to sponsor that legislation?
Well, so the simple fact that it's something that we don't think about very much, but has a tremendous impact on so many Maine people, so many people across America actually, who are caught in kind of the lower socioeconomic status, trying to climb out of that, trying to be able to work and better themselves and sell their labor, and you just can't do it like you used to. You know, I think I saw a statistic from the Institute for Justice that I think in the 1950s, 1 in 20 individuals in the labor force was required to get a license to work. But today, it's 1 in 3. You know, it used to be you could just start working tomorrow. You could go, if you wanted to make a few extra bucks, maybe painting people's houses. You could just start and offer your services and do that. But it is increasingly difficult. All the barriers that are put up by government to just be able to get this permission slip to be able to sell your labor, it's a tremendous barrier to people who oftentimes don't have a lot of resources to be able to better themselves. And so often in government, people want to fix all these problems with new government programs and new government laws, and how can we help people, and let's pass a new law for it, when we don't often look at what are the laws in place right now that create obstacles for people. Maybe rather than creating new programs and creating new laws, maybe we need to look at repealing some of the laws that are already in place that are making it more difficult for people.
Why do you think, as a legislator, you're up there in Augusta, you obviously you put this bill forth, you testified on it and what have you, but why do you think the legislature rushes to do this? Because more often than not, you see them establishing new barriers to employment, new barriers to entry, and when it comes time to review or try and look at these things and judge their merits, they're not willing to do that. Why do you think that is? Why is there a rush to implement, but nobody wants to go back and review the work that they've actually done?
Yeah, I think there's a tendency in government with legislators to want to be able to point to things that they've accomplished, new laws that they have passed. Personally, I'm proud when I can point to laws that I've repealed, but most people want to point to new laws that they've created. And it's not like these licensing requirements came all at once. They came piecemeal. It's, you know, one special interest group asking for a license for this thing here, then at a later point another special interest group asking for a license here, and it kind of piles up over time to, you know, the point over the last half century, as I pointed out. We've gone from being in America 1 in 20 people having to get a license to work to now 1 in 3 people having to get a license to work. So that's how this kind of piles up over time.
So obviously this isn't something that gridlocks the legislature. It's not something that we're shutting down state government about. It's more often than not a issue that they try to stay away from. Do you think that's because of the special interest influence? One thing that I saw in the process of completing our occupational licensing report, I came across something that said that every industry at some point in time or another has asked government for licensure to be regulated. What impact do you think that has?
You're right. The special pleading from special interests is a big result of why, first of all, these occupational licensing requirements come into place, and second of all, the reason that they stay in place. Because once it's established, you have people who benefit from these licenses being in place. And it's not the public. It's not the consumer. It's not the customers. It is the licensees. It's the people who are fortunate enough to have the license. Because once they have that and other people don't, they have a government barrier to entry for others. They are able to restrict competition from, if I had, so let's take one of the examples in your report, the Let Us Work report here, interior design. That's one of the things in there that just kind of jumps off the page to me and says, we really require people to have a license in order to offer their services to do interior design. So what is the public safety interest in that? It'd be kind of hard to point out. I mean, I guess, maybe you get someone who's an unlicensed interior designer and you get bad shag carpeting in your apartment or your
Right.
home, and it conflicts with the paintings or what have you. I mean, obviously there's no
It hurts the feng shui.
the feng shui. I guess that can be, and who knows? If your feng shui is off, maybe you trip and stumble, and I don't know, maybe maybe that's where the public health risk is. But obviously, I'm being a little facetious there. But the thing is, once these are in place, you have a whole special interest group with an economic incentive to lobby the government to maintain the status quo. Because if anyone can just come in and be an interior designer, well, then you're not going to be able to charge the same amounts. You're going to have to demonstrate in a real way why your services as an interior designer are better than just this person who stumbles in off the street and picks up the position. Maybe someone just has a knack for it, and we don't have to have government certify what the path is to become an interior designer. But that's exactly what we have in place right now.
What we see a lot is obviously the special interests come in. They ask for licensing. We're told that licensing itself is supposed to protect the public, and that's why it's in place. Do you believe that's true? Are they really there to protect the public? Maybe in some occupations, particularly in the medical field, where the costs associated with malpractice or the physical harm that could be done to you from a bad or poor practitioner is pretty severe. But do you really think government enacts these barriers to protect people, or you think they're trying to protect active licensees at the behest of the special interests that introduce these laws?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about areas like medical profession, I think there's a much stronger argument for licensing. I still think there are arguments to be made that private certifying organizations could handle a lot of this without government needing to do it. But let's set those aside, because that's not. There is a much stronger case to be made in like the medical profession for licensing on the basis of public safety. But of course, there's no argument to be made for public safety when it comes to licensing interior design or hair braiding or sign language interpreters or auctioneers or taxidermists. I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, these are licenses that have no bearing on public safety whatsoever. So the question is, of course, there is a level to which people want the licenses to be able to point to a level of credibility, of standards, that, hey, I've met these certain standards, and therefore you should come to me, the licensed person, rather than some unlicensed person. And certainly that's a fair argument, but there's no real argument that I've ever heard for why we need government to do that instead of a private certifying organization.
That touches upon what I wanted to get to next, is that they say, as I had mentioned before, this is supposed to protect the public. Well, have you ever been up in Augusta and seen a member of the public, just a regular citizen, approach you or another lawmaker and say, hey, we really need this profession licensed because, I was hurt in some way, or I had to, pay a big bill for something? Do you see that, or is it typically the special interest?
It's always people who are in the profession who don't like competition. Now, of course, I mean, certainly there are, certainly I have like contractors come to me sometimes and say we should license contracting, and I've heard those arguments, and I get where they're coming from. I mean, certainly there are bad actors. There are people who come along and maybe do shoddy craftsmanship, but you know what? The market responds to that by that person gets a bad reputation. And if you have a bad reputation, people hear about that, and people are going to be less likely to work with you in the future, whether you have a license or not. In fact, I don't believe there has really been any real research done demonstrating that these licenses really protect the public in any way from bad actors. So, but what it does is it restricts competition, and it benefits those people who are fortunate enough to have a license.
So let's talk a little bit about LD 1036. I mentioned it at the top. When you brought that bill forward, we actually cite it in this report because it goes along with the idea of regulatory capture, which is these special interests want to be regulated by government because there is a benefit to them from being regulated. They get wage premiums, reduced competition. It inflates the cost of goods and services because they can charge more because that competition doesn't actually exist in a free market. For that bill, LD 1036, there were 53 pieces of testimony submitted. 50 of them were against your bill. All of them were people who were licensed in professions for which the bill intended to eliminate licensing requirements.
Well, I'll correct you there. The bill didn't even eliminate the licenses.
You're right.
It just said, let's study the issue. Let's have a comprehensive look at whether or not these licenses make sense. And that, even just raising the question, provoked a huge degree of backlash.
So for those 50 people who testified, do you remember, what industries were they from? What were some of the specific occupations that were outlined in that bill of the people who turned up to testify against you that day?
Well, a lot of them were, so the biggest share was of it was massage therapists. And I will say, hearing some of the arguments from them, I do think that there is a case to be made with massage therapy that you're actually putting your hands on people, and okay, maybe you could make an argument that there's a public.
I understand that far more than an interior designer.
I certainly understand that more, and so that's why I actually offered, okay, let's take massage therapy out of this, and let's leave that out. But then there was sign language interpreters. Sign language interpreters really objected to this because that was one of the things that it's licensed in Maine. We're one of the few states that actually licenses sign language interpreters. Most states don't, but we do here in Maine. And it's really hard for me to understand the argument why. I mean, if someone is a bad sign language interpreter and you are, a deaf person, I think you find out pretty quickly that this person doesn't know sign language.
Right. At
least when you had the guy at Nelson Mandela's funeral, like. If you remember the sign language interpreter there, I mean, we all found out pretty quickly, like, this guy doesn't know how to doesn't know sign language. It's the same as, like, if someone was interpreting French or German or anything. If they don't know the language, you're going to find out pretty quickly. And so there are free market ways to weed out people who are not proficient, not good actors. And I want to get back to an earlier point. About private certifying organizations. There's no
the ASE certification for mechanics, for instance. That's probably the most popular in terms of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if I'm a consumer, first of all, I want to be able to go to whoever I want to go to, whether they have an artificial government license or not. But I would look at, what are the certifications someone has? And frankly, a private certifying organization has their own reputation at stake if they certify people who are not up to standard and who do shoddy work. And so they have a built-in market incentive that, frankly, the government just doesn't have to make sure that anyone they sign off on and certify is up to high-quality standards. And then it's up to me as the consumer to say, do I want to go to someone with this private certification? Maybe it costs a little bit more, but I know there's an expectation of quality, or do I want to go to someone who is maybe not certified, give them a chance, and in that case it's buyer beware, but it's my choice as a consumer to make that choice for myself.
I'm glad you touch upon the private accreditation there because, and the reputation, they put their reputation at stake. People wouldn't care about the Better Business Bureau if they were just handing out accreditations willy-nilly to anybody. So that's a great point you make. But I want to go back a little bit to 1036 and that law, LD 1036. What I'm curious about specifically is why do you think that bill, as you said, was only a review? We weren't eliminating anything. We just wanted to review. We wanted to study these. Why do you think there wasn't an appetite? Was it and the reason why I ask is, do you think it's solely special interest, or do you think part of it is that, the legislature they now look back on all the licensing laws on the books in Maine and say, wow, we've got a real doozy here if we want to try and study this.
I certainly think there probably is an element to that, and that it's a lot of work. But I think the biggest element is, look, I had plenty of Democrat co-sponsors on that bill when I initially put it in, until all the special interests came out and against it, and then suddenly they backed away very quickly. Because it's interesting, this has not been a partisan issue in the past. I mean, when Senator Ann Haskell, a Democrat from Portland, sponsored a bill to remove the licensing requirement for hair braiding, which I was proud to be a co-sponsor of, and I was so proud of her for sponsoring a bill to repeal the law rather than create one. I said, I will sign on to this immediately. That sailed through, went through committee, went to the House and Senate, went through unanimously, no problem. But there wasn't, the special interest didn't really come out and oppose that one. But when the special interests came out, these entrenched interests came out in a big way against raising the question. I think that the danger for them is if we're even allowed to ask the question, if we're even allowed to put a question mark on the end of whether or not these licenses should be in place, if we explore that, we're probably going to find that these are not benefiting the public.
Right.
And that's dangerous to them. It's dangerous to their economic interests because it means that we may repeal some of these requirements, and then they may have to face competition.
You had touched on this just a minute ago. You said you didn't think that this was a partisan issue.
At least it wasn't originally.
Right. Do you just see it as a struggle between regulators and the actively regulated, or I guess where do we move from here? You know what I mean, to try and get some movement, get some action in the right direction on this issue.
I think we really have to make we have to focus on the lower income, lower class people that these occupational licensing requirements are hurting. It is creating, in some cases, insurmountable barriers for people without access to the means to, say for example, going back to interior design. Interior design, one of the requirements, as you note in your report, one of the requirements is you have to have a bachelor's degree in order to be an interior designer. Not everyone can afford to get a bachelor's degree, not just in terms of the cost of a bachelor's degree, but also in terms of the time, the opportunity cost. I mean, 4 years you have to devote 4 years to education in order to get a license in order to decorate the inside of people's houses. I mean, that's crazy.
Yes.
And that's something, I mean, if you are, let's say you're, a creative, artistic 18-year-old person coming out of school, maybe you're coming from a poor family, but you have a knack for interior design, and I want to give you a chance. I say, hey, I'd like to hire you to come, design, do some interior design in my home, and I'd like to give you a chance and see how it's done. And frankly, if it doesn't work out, you haven't done any irreparable harm to me. I'm not in danger.
And that should be the standard, shouldn't it? You know what I mean? If an occupation isn't legitimately posing health and safety risks to the public, then why is the state wasting its time in licensing it?
Right. It's a waste of taxpayer money, and it really hurts some of our least well-off in society. You
had talked just a minute ago about how a lot of people at the lower end of the income spectrum don't have the time and money to be able to invest to get these licenses. I want to go back to the hair braider example, because I know there's some unique stuff that they were required to do only to braid hair, and I was wondering if you could talk about that briefly.
Yeah, so, and this is actually the case of hair braiding. Now, I think the reason this came up as a bill is because the case of hair braiding licensing requirements was not just an issue in Maine, but it was an issue in several other states, and there was a very high-profile case out in Utah that the Institute for Justice highlighted, of a woman she was actually from Africa. She was an immigrant, came to America, and she was in Africa. She had developed a skill of hair braiding, and she came over and established in Utah and wanted to offer those services, and she did it for 4 years until some competitor came to her and said, if you keep this up, we're going to report you to the licensing board because you don't have a license to do this. And the license that she would have been required to get was an overall license for, I believe, overall cosmetology and she would have had to have gone to school.
Stuff that, by the way, has nothing to do with hair braiding, right?
Right. She would have had to do years of education, spent a great deal of time and money in order to get this license, and the education she would have been required to get had nothing to do with hair braiding. They didn't even teach it. So that's one of the problems with a lot of these occupational licensure requirements is the standards, the hoops that you are forced to jump through. Sometimes they're just completely arbitrary. They're designed by the licensing boards for the people already in the profession, and they can be designed to keep people out.
That's a great point. When I was doing this report and going through the governing structure of licensing boards in Maine, what you typically see is that the majority of these members are, number one, licensed in whichever occupations are being regulated by the board, and on top of that, they're required to have sometimes 3, 5, or 10 years of holding a license in the state of Maine to be allowed to sit on that board.
Yeah.
What I want is, do you think that's a fair structure in general? Should we have anybody making rules of their own industry? You know what I mean? Should a select handful of people really be tasked with regulating their entire industry, because they can essentially bar new people from entering simply because they don't want the competition, perhaps?
You know, there's this misconception that a lot of people have about government and regulations that I hear a lot, that big business doesn't want to be regulated. You know, in fact, I've had big businesses and lobbyists on behalf of big businesses come to me and say, hey, we've got this regulation we'd like to have in place, and how rare is it that, you know, we're in the industry and we're actually asking to be regulated? How rare is that? And I just think that's not rare at all. It happens all the time.
Right.
Because
there's a reason
there's a reason for it. And the reason is the big businesses, the established people in the industry can afford to deal with the regulations. They can afford to hire the compliance people. They can afford to jump through all the hoops. But if you're a new person coming into this industry who's not established, who doesn't have a great deal of capital already, you often can't afford. So that chokes people out of the industry. And that's why we need to be very careful when we are throwing new regulations on top of all of these industries, is it doesn't benefit the little guys. It benefits the big guys.
The last thing I want to talk about today, is, I guess it's actually two topics, but I call them the 2 R's of occupational licensing. That's reciprocity and recidivism. First, I'll start with reciprocity. Licenses that are granted in Maine are not good in other states, and other states that license professionals, those licenses aren't good in Maine. We talk a lot about what we can do to attract new people to the state, talented people who will grow our economy. What impact do you think occupational licensing has on this, and why isn't this an issue that's more on the forefront, I guess, in terms of economic issues in Maine?
Yeah, I mean, how crazy is it? You know, let's take well, geez, my favorite example, of course, is interior design, because I think that's one of the most ridiculous. So let's stick with that example. I mean, how crazy is it? You've gone through the whole process, you've gotten your interior design license in Maine, and then you go to another state and you've got to start all over and go through the process all over again, you know, just because you move. And all of your experience in that field doesn't count. Your license doesn't transfer. Yeah, it is incredibly disruptive, you know, if you move to a new state and you have to start all over and jump through all the hoops all over again. And obviously, if you could do interior design in one state and you've got experience, you know, geez, even if we could somehow make an argument that bad interior design was endangering public safety, I don't know how you could say, you know, if you've got 10 years of experience in it in one state, that somehow you're a danger to public safety if you go and do it in another state without their separate license.
The last thing I want to talk about is recidivism, and this has a pretty big impact on occupational licensing as a whole. For people who have paid their debt to society, is it really fair that they're locked out of work opportunities like this? Because what I saw when I was going through, as I touched upon a moment ago, going through the governing boards and the structure of these governing boards, what you typically see are good character or moral upstanding character clauses that say that to be granted a license, you must be a good person. And so you have a board comprised of people who you would actively be competing with if they grant you a license, and perhaps there's something on your record from 10, 20, 30 years ago, and you're not a good character. What's your take on that?
You know, I think this is a very, very good point. And partly, I mean, that's why I've been, aside from this issue, but it's certainly intertwined. I've been a huge advocate for criminal justice reform here in Maine, because we're supposed to be a nation that believes in second chances. That especially where so many of the things that people are incarcerated for are often victimless crimes, nonviolent drug crimes. Someone makes a stupid mistake, maybe when they're a young adult, they get involved with drugs and they get caught. And that can follow them and destroy their lives. I mean, even when you get out of jail, that follows you around like a scarlet letter. And the fact that that would play a role in your ability to get a license in order to sell your labor. I mean, it's incredibly hard already when you have served your time and you're coming out and you're trying to get established. It's incredibly hard already for people to give you a chance. And the fact that we would create more artificial barriers, that even if I wanted to give someone a chance, myself, the customer, if I wanted to hire someone who had been convicted of a nonviolent drug crime in the past, for example, to do interior design at my home, that should be my choice.
Right.
That should not be the choice of some government board. That should not be, and of course, when people get locked out of career opportunities, the chances are, much greater that they'll go back to what they know, because if that means going back to, selling drugs, because that's the only economic opportunity that is available to them, because we've shut them out of every legal pathway open to them, and then that's terrible.
Well, I really thank you for sitting down and talking about this with us. It's not, like I said, it's not the most contentious of issues, but it's something that I believe Maine really needs to look at as we go into the future as it relates to our economy and what we can do to help workers in the state of Maine. So I want to thank you very much, Eric, for being with us here today, and stay tuned for the next Maine policy discussion.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for having me.